So as we've already started framing today, it's much more. Yesterday was a bit more big picture. So the initial framing was kind of very meta, and we talked about mythopoetics. Apologies for the language, but here we're going to be diving down a little bit more into a bit more coming down to earth and talking about how some of these big ideas that we've been playing with can be applied to the real world. So we have three excellent speakers. We have, for the sense-making track, we have Carl Miller, Imagined Future, Tia Kansara, and Meaning, Alex Evans. So I'm going to introduce the speakers in turn, and each will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for them to pick up off what each other has said and any questions that came up for them while they were listening to the other speak. So first up, we're going to have Alex Evans. And Alex has been on the channel a couple of times now, I think. And Alex used to be a government advisor before getting quite disillusioned with the world of kind of policy and government. And I think it's fair to say kind of realized that the world of policy wasn't really equipped or didn't have a lot of language for really understanding people, understanding psychology. So he now is in this really interesting place where he sort of straddles the world of psychology and policy through his new project called the Collective Psychology Project. And before that, he wrote a really amazing book called The Myth Gap, which was all about how this kind of focus on data and statistics just really didn't speak to, like we needed to really engage with much deeper narratives, like how religions and our sort of deepest stories are able to tap into these deeper narratives. But something about the way we do politics and something about the way that we do culture now just doesn't speak to that level. So, Alex, I'd love if you would take it away and tell us what you're thinking since the beginning. Like, how is COVID in particular?
Thanks, David. I'm going to try and share my screen. Has that worked? So, yeah, great to be with you today. As David just explained, I used to be a policy wonk. And I spent a lot of time in government and in the United Nations. And all through that time, the idea I had was that basically changing the world was a question of getting the right evidence in front of the right policymakers. And then I became quite disillusioned with that. I realized that that wasn't the case and instead became fascinated in the role of collective stories as a way that we use to make sense of the world and our place in it, and especially the really deep shared stories that we've come to know as myths. And that's what this book, The Myth Gap, which came out in 2017, is all about. Now, as David just said, sometimes those myths are about religions, sometimes they're about heroes and quests, but in all cases, they're really deep stories that tell us both about ourselves, including often holding up a mirror to the sides of our nature that we might prefer not to look at, and also about where we are, how we got here, and where we might be trying to go. The thing that fascinated me is that although historically we've had this central place for mythology in the human experience, we've sort of junked a lot of our myths over recent years, and especially in the last, say, 50 years or so. If you look up myth in the thesaurus these days, you actually find it in the same entry as things like bunk or fabrication or fiction. And we've basically decided that things are either literally, scientifically true, or they're not true at all. And myths have fared pretty badly in this territory. And so that's how we've come to find ourselves in this myth gap that we now occupy. It's not my phrase, it's from a great writer called Jonas Sachs, who observes that, here we are on the left, modern, rational life, alienated on the right from those deep shared stories that have sustained us for so long in the human experience. And as Carl Jung recognized about 100 years ago, this comes with real dangers because, as he says, the man who thinks he can live without myth is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or the ancestral life within him, or yet with contemporary society. And what Jung understood, I think, is that myths are a bit like our magnetic north. And if we don't have those shared reference points, then we're a bit like a compass that doesn't have north to point to. We're just not sure, who we are, what we're trying to do. Those deep questions of meaning and identity and purpose become kind of confused. And part of the reason I think that's especially important is because, as Terry Pratchett observes here, stories don't just describe our reality, they also create it. Because when we use a story to make sense of what's happening and then act accordingly, that in effect creates reality. And if that sounds a bit abstract, just consider what happens when you see a run on a bank. The story starts to take hold that there isn't enough money to meet everyone's deposits. People start queuing up outside the bank to get their money out. And hey presto, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The story becomes true because people have behaved accordingly. Now, all of this is especially relevant for COVID-19, as it turns out. And to see why that is, it's worth noting that this is one of those moments where our kind of master narrative, not quite as deep as a myth, but the kind of basic story is breaking down. And that's something that doesn't happen very often. It happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall or 9/11 or the financial crisis. And now it's happening again. It's one of those moments where we're not sure what we can assume, what we can take for granted, what kind of facts we can rely on, if you like. When you have that situation that the master narrative's broken down, we're a bit like a kind of murmuration of starlings. With this much uncertainty, things like panic can ripple very, very quickly through the collective central nervous system that social media, for example, has become. And so it really matters that the right kinds of stories, and also that we're able to manage our mental and emotional states in these sorts of conditions. Now, this is a report that I co-wrote with a couple of friends, which came out actually just about 3 weeks ago, which is all about collective grief in the time of COVID-19. Grief not just for the enormous number of people who've died over the past few months, but also for the passing of a way of life, because so much of what we've come to know as familiar is not going to go back to normal, even after the pandemic. And one of the things we observe in that report is that although we're prone to look at this situation and say, wow, this is completely unprecedented, actually, if you look at deep time, our ancestors have faced cataclysms like this lots of times before. And it turns out they have lots to teach us, in particular about the sorts of shared stories that can really help us through moments like this. And I'm going to just talk about 3 of those in particular. One set of myths that can be really helpful in a cataclysm are apocalypse myths. Now, of course, we have a hugely fertile genre of fiction and movies that's all about apocalypse. And so when we think of the word apocalypse, we tend to think of the end of the world, everything falling apart. But in the precise mythological sense, apocalypse means something different. It means a revealing, a revelation, where you get to see, what is actually real. And that's something I think that has all sorts of interesting relevance to this moment we're in with COVID-19, because suddenly there's a revelation, a revealing of, for example, our vulnerabilities that come with our globalized societies, our interdependencies with each other. Also, a light gets shone on things like who are the real key workers in a society, the people that we really rely on. So one thing that's happening in this moment is a whole lot of revealing. A second set of myths that we talk about in that report is myths about restoration. These are deep stories in which something fundamental has gone wrong, gone out of balance, and needs to be restored, kind of brought back into balance. So if apocalypse myths are stories about something being revealed, these are really myths about something being healed. And this stone that you can see on this slide is a carving in the valley where I live in Yorkshire of a tree of life from late Neolithic times. And the tree of life is a kind of great symbol in the whole restoration kind of thing. It's an emblem of cyclicality. And actually, if you look at the Bible, for example, the story arc of the whole thing across all 66 books starts with a tree of life in the center of the Garden of Eden and ends with a tree of life restored to the New Jerusalem. It's a really kind of deep myth about restoration, something being healed. And it's one that's recurring again over and over in popular fiction and movies at the moment. So whether you're looking at Harry Potter or Aslan or Anna at the end of Frozen or Frodo in Lord of the Rings, these are myths where something has gone out of balance, and what's needed to bring things back into balance is an act of self-sacrifice, of atonement that brings things back into balance. And it's a sort of, in psychological terms, you could say that this is about the self-sacrifice of the grasping ego that's always looking for more, and that instead recognizes itself as part of a larger collective. And the way that we've been sacrificing, for instance, the education of 1.6 billion young people during lockdown, or that so many people have sacrificed economic well-being, you can look at that as a kind of a form of restoration, of self-sacrifice to protect the larger collective. And then a third set of myths that I think are really relevant at this time are myths about emergence, where something's being born. Now, again, if you look at some of the myths that are doing the rounds in popular fiction at the moment, you see lots of these moments of self-sacrifice that I just talked about, leading to rebirth. But a very consistent theme is that when a rebirth happens or a resurrection, it's not back to the same as before. So when Obi-Wan is reborn in Star Wars, he comes back in a kind of spirit form. When Gandalf is reborn, he comes back as Gandalf the White, not Gandalf the Grey. In his Dark Materials, Lyra is changed by going to the land of the dead. And of course, in the New Testament, when Jesus is reborn, to begin with, Mary Magdalene and his disciples don't even recognize him. So this is the point that when you go through a rebirth experience, you come back changed. Things are not the same as before. And emergence myths are also kind of relevant when you think about the idea of humanity as if it were a lifetime. So this is a quote that I love from Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, where he talks about how we're still just children and children grow up and we as a species are going to grow up too. And the only thing I disagree with about this quote is that actually I think that in a lot of ways, humanity is going through its adolescent years right now, and we have been doing for some time. There's a great writer called Dwayne Elgin who likes to do a straw poll with audiences all over the world. And he says to people, if humanity was a person, would you say that humanity was a child or a teenager or an adult or an elder? And he finds that all over the world, in all different cultures, people typically reply in, 2/3 or 3/4 majority that humans are in their teenage years. And it makes a kind of sense because in our teenage years, we're testing the limits. We're not always mindful of consequences. We're very concerned with maximizing liberty and individual freedom. But of course, adolescence is also the time when initiation is a really central idea, that in indigenous societies all over the world, adolescence is the time where you face a kind of supreme test, and there may be the possibility of death, the definite probability of some kind of wounding, but also the prospect of coming through the fire to a genuine relationship of kind of co-creation, of maturity, of being kind of a full adult who's, part of larger society. And in lots of ways, this kind of liminal moment that we're at right now is one where initiatory ideas have deep resonance and power. So that's just a quick taste of some of the stuff that's in the myth gap. And then just to bring it up to date in the last couple of minutes with some of the things I'm working on now at the Collective Psychology Project. The project is really at its core about the idea that we have a choice in this moment between seeing ourselves as part of a larger us, one that includes all of the people on Earth alive today, plus future generations, plus other species, or instead of fragmenting into a them and us of the sort that we've seen so much of in recent years with political polarization and so forth. This graphic shows Twitter accounts in the United States and how Republican and Democrat-oriented Twitter accounts have kind of polarized into these echo chambers. And of course, this choice that we make between a larger us or a them and us, or indeed seeing ourselves as just an atomized I, is one that has deep relevance for coronavirus. When we saw that round of panic buying taking place a couple of months ago, that was all of us in real time making decisions about, are we going to just go into panic mode and shop to try and fill our personal bunkers, or are we going to think of the welfare of the larger collective? Or it's the same with social distancing. Are we going to consider the welfare of the larger us and take decisions consistent with that welfare, like I will observe social distancing protocols? Or are we going to assume, well, I probably won't get it, I figure I'll just take the risk, which is atomized I thinking. And similarly, when you see politicians kind of indulging in blame games like Trump in this headline here, that is them and us thinking, not the sort of thing that's going to enable us to navigate this crisis safely. But then one of the other things we talk about a lot in the project is that one of the really key determinants of whether we're able to stay in larger us thinking or whether we unravel into them and us thinking is how we respond to perceived threats. And of course, coronavirus is a huge perceived threat. All of us have heard of the fight or flight impulse, or more accurately, the fight, flight, freeze impulse. It's a kind of physiological reaction to perceived threat that's hardwired into us. And when we go into fight or flight mode, we're really just concerned with our individual selves. It's not a very socially useful response. It makes us less empathetic, more prone to extremism. But psychologists also say that there's an alternative thing we can reach for called tend and befriend, which is a behavioral response to perceived threat. And it's one where we tend ourselves and our family groups, and we befriend other people to build social networks that will help us to do that tending. And this is way more useful in a systemic crisis like coronavirus or like climate change. It makes us more empathetic, more concerned with the welfare of the collective. And finally, just to wrap it up, how do we then stay in tend and befriend as much of the time as possible? Well, in the project, we talk about ABC, and they stand for agency, belonging, and conscious self-awareness. Agency, first of all, is whether we feel like we have power in our lives, in our communities, or in politics more generally. And so when we're stocking up, panic buying because we're worried about coronavirus, you can see that as an attempt to feel a sense of agency, to have some kind of control over our circumstances. But it's important that agency moves beyond just ourselves and talks about, focuses on rather a larger us rather than just our individual selves. So that's a touch on agency. And, a great example of larger us agency is the COVID mutual assistance groups that have been springing up all over the place, seeing communities self-organize to look out for their vulnerable members and help each other. Belonging, secondly, is all about, do we feel we belong or do we feel disconnected and lonely? There's lots of evidence that when we do feel chronically lonely, it's not just terrible for our health, it makes us way less empathetic, much more vulnerable to fight or flight reactions. And of course, a huge number of people in society feel very, very alone during the lockdowns that we've just been through or are still going through in many countries. And again, it's really heartening to see how much self-organized work is taking place to increase connection. I mean, this is a couple in London who just put this little form through all of their neighbors' doors and developed these dense relationships that didn't exist before on things like Facebook or WhatsApp, so that they're creating connection, creating community, which makes us more resilient. It kind of creates a larger us. And then the C, finally, is for conscious self-awareness. And this is really about whether we have the self-mastery, if you like, to choose how to react to stuff rather than having our amygdala choose for us and take us straight into fight or flight. And partly that's about self-care, knowing the techniques that enable us to feel rooted, to take a breath, whether that's meditation or Stoic philosophy or any number of different techniques. But it's also about curating how we contribute to collective consciousness, especially on things like social media. Are we stopping to think about, what we're about to share, about whether it could be fake news, for example? Are we stopping and taking a breath before we flame someone in one of those polarized arguments you get on Twitter so often? Because that is us playing our role in a collective central nervous system and remembering that our mental and emotional states are infectious in moments like this. So that's just a quick snapshot of some of the deep stories that may be useful in this moment, the importance of seeing ourselves as part of a larger us rather than the them and us, and some of the techniques from collective psychology that can potentially help us to do that. If you're interested in finding out more, here's the website, but I'll stop there. Thanks again for the invitation to join me today.